when Emil Kilgour died on a cot in the back bay of his own garage, 74 years old. With the stove still warm beside him, his 2 children had the estate carved up in 11 days. The house on Bower Street was listed before the church basement had finished the sandwiches. The savings were split before the funeral home mailed the last invoice. His son Warren took every single thing that could be turned into a number. His daughter Roberta took the one thing nobody in the family would touch: a shut-down service station on Highway 11. 4 kilometers north of Wardlow Bend, with plywood over the office window, a septic field the township had flagged twice, and 2 banker's boxes her brother called scrap paper. She had $203 in her checking account. She had a welding torch she hadn't lit in 15 months. On a Thursday in the second week of November, with the ditches already crusted white, she drove out there to empty the place and let the scrap man have the rest. And in the parts room at the back, under a section of concrete, the same dull gray as all the other concrete, bolted flush into the slab and sealed with a latch you'd never find unless you were on your knees looking for it, was a steel footlocker that no contractor ever installed. What Emil Kilgour had sealed inside it was something neither of his children knew existed. This is Ultra Stories. Sit with us for a while. This one takes a bit of telling, and we'd rather tell it slow. 11 days before that Thursday, Roberta had stood in her father's kitchen watching her brother run packing tape over a box of the old man's flannel shirts. He worked the way a man works when he's moving house, not burying a father. Quick, efficient, no wasted motion. Warren had the realtor out the morning after the burial, a woman in a good coat, who paced the rooms with a laser measure and used the word footprint 4 times, while Emil's reading glasses were still folded on the sill above the sink where he'd left them. "House'll move," Warren said. He pressed the tape flat with his thumb and didn't look up. "Market's decent even up here right now. Property taxes don't much care how anybody feels." "He's been gone 5 days, Warren." "I'm not being cold. I'm being the one who does it. Somebody has to be the one who does it." His wife Deirdre stood in the doorway with her phone, scrolling. She had come inside long enough to claim the pine sideboard that had been their mother's and a set of Blue Mountain pottery that predated Roberta by a decade. The rest, she said, wasn't worth what the U-Haul would cost. Roberta watched the furniture go out the door in pieces. The recliner where her father fell asleep to the hockey game with the sound down. The kitchen table where he ate the same breakfast for 4 decades. 2 eggs hard, brown toast, coffee black enough to strip paint. The dresser with the swollen drawer where he kept a photograph of her mother tucked behind a deck of crib cards he never dealt again after she died. Warren kept the truck. He'd been borrowing it anyway. He kept the savings, $26,000 and change, after he took what he called executor's compensation, and paid for the stone. He kept the tools out of the garage at the house and sold most of them to a man off Kijiji before Roberta even knew they'd been listed. What he didn't want was the station. "It's a liability," he said, and set the keys on the counter beside the 2 boxes. "Roof's soft in the corner. Guy in Cochrane said maybe $500 for the hoist and the compressor, but you'd have to clear it out yourself, and honestly I don't know if it's worth your gas." He nudged the boxes toward her with the side of his shoe. "Dad's stuff from out there. Coveralls, receipts, an old tobacco tin with about 9 cents in it. I already went through it. There's nothing." Roberta picked up the keys. They were warm from his hand, strung on a brass ring worn to a shine, and the largest one had a strip of masking tape gone soft and yellow with printed on it in her father's careful block capitals, the same capitals that had labeled every jar of screws in her childhood. "So that's it," she said. "That's it." She looked around the kitchen, half emptied already, turning by the hour into somebody else's house. "Okay," she said. The station had been closed for 14 months by then. Emil kept it running until the week he couldn't get up off the creeper on his own, and then he locked the bay and never opened it again. Though people in town said he still drove out most mornings, sat in the office with a thermos he'd filled at home, and watched the transports come south through the cut. Roberta didn't know any of that. She knew only that a dead man's grief had landed on her, and she had nowhere to set it down, because her own life had run clean out of room. She was renting a 1-bedroom above a Chinese restaurant in Sudbury. The radiator banged all night and heated nothing. There was a stack of envelopes on the counter she had stopped opening around the middle of August. Inside each one, folded neat, was the failure of a business she'd built with her own 2 hands. 15 months since she had lit a torch. 15 months since she'd stood in the shop she'd mortgaged her house to open, a fabrication outfit doing snowplow blades and custom guardrail out of a rented bay off Regent, and told 6 people there wouldn't be another check. Her biggest client had gone under, owing her $91,000. She'd gone under owing everyone else. She'd handed her foreman the keys and driven home, and hadn't picked up a stinger since. And there had been a smaller failure first. One she never said out loud, not to Warren, not to her ex-husband Dean, not to anyone. The night her father had his first stroke, 2 years before he died, she didn't come. It was a Friday, she had a rush order going out Monday and a bank meeting she was already dreading. She told herself he was stable, that Warren was 90 minutes closer, that she'd drive down on the weekend. She didn't drive down on the weekend. She didn't drive down for 11 weeks, and by then he'd stopped mentioning it, which was worse. The shop folded anyway 7 months later. Somewhere in that arithmetic there was a number she could never make come out, even. She had traded her father for a thing she loved, and then the thing she loved had died too, and left her holding the receipt. So it was Thursday and gray, and the station sat waiting for her at the edge of a town she had spent her whole adult life driving away from. She parked her mother's old Corolla on the gravel apron and sat behind the wheel for a good 10 minutes before she could make herself get out. The scrap outfit opened at 9. If she could have the place cleared by then, she could let them strip it, walk away with maybe $400, keep the hydro on in Sudbury another month, while she figured out what a person is supposed to do when there's nothing left to figure out. She unlocked the side door of the office. The bell over it, an actual brass bell on a bent bracket, gave one dull note. And then the smell got her, and she had to put a hand flat on the door frame. Motor oil worked deep into the floor, the cold metal smell of a parched shelf, wood smoke soaked 40 years into the beams, and under all of it, faint and unmistakable, the smell that was simply a meal. The way a person's smell keeps living in a place long after the person has quit it. She stood in the doorway and breathed and didn't move. The office was exactly as he'd left it. 2 vinyl chairs, split and taped. A counter with a rubber mat worn through to the wood in the shape of a man's forearms. A rack of fan belts still hanging, sizes descending, dusty. A calendar from the Wardlow Bend Legion, turned to a month 14 months gone. And above the bay door on a board he'd cut and painted himself sometime before she was born, in the same block capitals as the masking tape. Open. Nobody freezes on my road. She stared at it a long while before she understood that she didn't understand it. It wasn't a slogan. It wasn't a joke about winter tires. It was a sentence, and it meant something specific, and she had no idea what. She walked through into the bay, and this was the first thing that didn't fit. It was clean, not neglected clean, not the dry sterility of a place gone dead. The concrete had been swept, the hoist arms were greased. The stove in the corner, an old barrel stove on brick, had ash in it that was maybe a week old, and beside it a rick of split birch stacked to the joist, seasoned, dry, ready. Her father had been dead 5 days. Somebody was heating this building. She would find 3 more things before that morning was out, and one of them was going to turn her life sideways. In the corner past the stove was a cot. Steel frame, thin mattress, 3 gray wool blankets folded square. It hadn't been there when she was a kid. Beside it a milk crate with a book on it, and beside that on the wall hung a photograph she had never seen. Emil at maybe 30, in a peaked cap, standing under a brand new sign, one hand up to shade his eyes from a sun that had set on that particular day 40-some years ago. He was laughing. Roberta couldn't remember the last time she'd seen her father laugh like that. She couldn't remember the last time she'd bothered to look. She sat down on the cot because her legs had stopped agreeing to hold her, and she let herself feel, for 1 whole minute, the full weight of where she'd landed. 47 years old, divorced 3 years, a dead business. A dead father she hadn't spoken to properly in 2. A brother who'd handed her a building he called a liability and 2 boxes he called nothing. She had come here to throw all of it in a bin. She put her face in her hands. She didn't cry. She'd done her crying months ago, alone on the floor of an empty shop, and what she had now was quieter than grief and thinner. The particular flatness of somebody who's run out of the energy to even mourn properly. Then she stood up, because the scrap outfit opened at 9, and she went to clear the parts room. It was a narrow room off the bay, walled in steel shelving, mostly picked over, boxes of gaskets for engines nobody built anymore, a drum of used oil. She worked fast, the way she'd always worked, because working fast is what you do when thinking is a thing you cannot afford. She'd stripped 2 shelves when the toe of her boot caught on a seam. She looked down, poured concrete, gray, unremarkable except for one rectangle near the back wall, maybe half a meter by a meter, where the gray was very slightly newer. A hairline edge a careless eye would slide right over. Roberta knelt. She'd spent 25 years around floors and welds and fitted metal, and she knew what a slab pour was supposed to look like, and this was not it. Her fingers found a recessed latch tucked hard against the baseboard, painted to disappear. Invisible unless you were looking for it, which she was, now, and her heart had started to do something it had not done in a very long time. She worked the latch with her thumbnail. It resisted, then let go with a flat metallic click. A panel of concrete-faced steel lifted on a hinge, and beneath it was a footlocker welded to a frame set into the slab, 20 centimeters deep, lined with a folded moving blanket so that nothing inside would ever rattle. The things in there had not been dumped. They had been placed, arranged the way a man arranges the things that matter. She lifted them out one at a time and set them on the cold floor. 4 ledgers, hardbound, cloth spines cracked from years of opening, corners gone soft as suede, a player's tobacco tin, lid pressed down tight, far heavier than a tobacco tin has any business being. A bundle of envelopes, dozens of them, bound with a length of butcher's twine, the paper at the bottom of the stack gone the color of weak tea, a savings passbook, pale green, stamped Northern Shield Credit Union, a manila envelope, thick, sealed, a law firm's name on a label in the corner. And underneath everything, laid flat against the steel, a plain white envelope with a single word across the front in blue ink, in handwriting she had known her entire life, and had stopped reading the love in a long time ago, Bertie. She sat back on her heels with all of it spread around her on the concrete, and her hands were not steady. Out on the highway a transport downshifted and was gone, and the silence came back, and in the silence she could hear herself breathing. If you've come this far with Bertie, into that cold little room, stay with us, because everything that man buried under his own floor is about to come up into the light, and none of it is the man his children thought they were burying. She opened the passbook first, because a passbook was a thing she understood. The account was in Emil Kilgour's name. The first deposit was dated 33 years earlier. $2. After that the entries ran down the page and onto the next and the next and the next. A deposit nearly every week, never large. Sometimes $2, sometimes $6, once in a while a 20. The last entry was made 8 days before he died, and the running balance beside it read $46,318. Roberta looked at that number until it quit meaning anything at all. Her father had run the 2B service station, where an oil change was $39.95. He had never in his life owned a thing that wasn't dented. Warren had already emptied the only account any of them knew about, the one at the credit union in town with $26,000 in it. This one had never been spoken of. Built $2 at a time across 3 decades. A tobacco tin emptied out at a teller's window, week after week after week for 33 years. She opened the tin. It was packed with folded bills, 5s and 10s gone soft as cloth, and loose loonies and toonies, and on top a slip of paper in Emil's hand. For the tin. So the next one gets home. She didn't know yet what the tin was. She set it down very carefully, the way you set down something that might wake up. She opened the manila envelope. A deed. This property. The lot and structure at Highway 11 and the Wardlow Bend Concession Road purchased 12 years ago, cash for $31,000. Buyer. Emil Joseph Kilgour. Roberta frowned at it a long moment. She had gone her whole life, assuming her father rented that station from some numbered company in North Bay, the way he had when she was small enough to fall asleep on the office counter. Clipped behind the deed was a second sheet, a smaller adjacent parcel purchased the same day, and a note in his script, 3 words and a name. Hold in trust. Halloran and Vance. She had never heard of Halloran and Vance. She had not known her father owned the ground under his own boots. She picked up the white envelope with her name on it and turned it over. The back was blank. She slid her thumb under the flap and drew out 4 pages, folded in thirds, the writing steady at the top and looser by the end. Bertie, it started. If you've got this in your hands, then I'm dead, and you're kneeling on my parts room floor in the cold wondering what in God's name your old man was doing all those years. That's a fair thing to wonder. I ought to have told you. I meant to, 100 times. But every time I got the words halfway up, they came out sounding either soft in the head or like I was patting myself on the back. And the whole entire point of it was that it was never supposed to be either of those. So I wrote it down instead, and I put it where only somebody willing to do the ugly work of clearing this place out with her own hands would ever get to it. I figured if you came all the way out here to shovel my mess into a bin, then you were the one. You always were the one. You just had to lose enough to come back and see it." She stopped. She read the next paragraph, and something in her chest drew tight. "You'll have noticed the place is too warm for a man who's been dead a week. That's Toivo across the road. He's been keeping that stove fed and the pipes from splitting every winter since my hands went. There's a yard light on the pole out front. I want you to leave it on. I have kept a light burning on that pole every single night for 43 years, Bertie, and I never told a living soul why. Not your mother, not the whole of it." So she turned to the ledgers, because she had to. She opened the top one to a page near the middle, and her father's small, even handwriting filled it. Dated entries, one after another after another. Feb 9, transport driver, no name given, came in at 2:40 a.m. Alternator seized 20 kilometers south. Towed him in with the wrecker, put him on the cot, fed him. Rebuilt the alternator with a core off the shelf. Told him no charge, he argued. Told him to fix somebody else's someday and we'd call it square. She turned the page. April 3, the Sauve girl again. 2 little ones in the back and no boots on either of them. Husband gone to Alberta and not sending. Filled her tank. Put a case of Kraft dinner and a bag of apples in her trunk while she was in the washroom so she wouldn't have to say no to my face. She's proud. Proud is only hurt standing up straight. Roberta flipped forward, then back, then forward again. Hundreds of entries. Thousands. Each one dated. Each one a person, a problem. A small quiet thing her father had done in the middle of the night when nobody was watching, and had told nobody about afterward. Not his wife, not his children, not the men who drank his coffee at that counter every morning for 40 years, and went home believing they knew him. He had run a service station for 4 decades, and somewhere inside that, running under it the whole time, he had also been running something else entirely. A thing with no name, no charity number, no sign. And she was learning the first word of it at 47, on her knees, on his floor. She went back to the letter. The light on the pole is for a girl named Cassie Poirier who I never once spoke to, and who I think about most nights of my life. The winter I was 31, my second year with this place, a girl knocked on that bay door at 11 at night. 22 years old. Car quit on her south of here. She was walking to her sister's in Cochrane. She asked could I open up, could she sit by the stove until the buses ran. I'd been under a truck since 6 that morning. I told her through the glass that we were closed and to come back at 7. I watched her nod like she understood, and I watched her go off up the shoulder of the 11 with her hands in her pockets. They found her the next afternoon in the ditch about 3 kilometers up, sat down against a fence post like she'd only stopped to rest. I had a stove. I had a roof. I had a pot of coffee that wasn't even cold yet, and I sent her out into it because I was tired. I have not let that light go out one single night since. Anybody who drives that road at any hour of any night knows that, as long as the light's on, there's a man awake in there, and the door will open, and there'll be heat and something hot, and nobody will ask them one single question they don't feel like answering. That's all it ever was, Bertie. A light on a pole so the next Cassie Poirier doesn't walk off into the dark. Roberta set the pages in her lap. She was crying now, in the way she hadn't let herself in over a year, and she didn't try to make it stop. The bay was cold and dim around her. It smelled of oil and wood smoke and 40 years of her father, and she sat on the floor of the room where he had hidden the truth of his whole life, and she read the rest of his handwriting. The handwriting of a man she thought she'd known. A man who went to work and came home tired. A man she had never once, not one time in 47 years, thought to ask what it was that tired him out. The scrap outfit opened at 9. At 20 past, Roberta was still on the floor, surrounded by everything her father had kept hidden from the people who loved him, reading about strangers whose names she would spend the rest of her life learning. She didn't call the scrap outfit. She didn't call anybody. The oldest ledger was nearly black, its spine held with an elastic that turned to dust when she touched it. The first entry was dated 43 years ago, the spring after Cassie Poirier died. Kept the light on. A boy came, maybe 16, run off from somewhere and wouldn't say where. Fed him, let him sleep in the office chair. Wouldn't take money for the bus, so I put it in his coat while he slept. Marguerite doesn't know I do this. She'd only worry. But I can't keep running that road in my head, the one where I send them off. So I'll keep the light on instead. Marguerite was Roberta's mother, gone 19 years now, a heart attack in the garden. So either she had known all of it and kept his secret to the grave, or he had carried the whole thing alone for 4 decades. Roberta sat there and could not decide which one was heavier. She kept reading, and the entries described a town she'd grown up inside and never once seen. A woman whose husband hit her, who used to drive out to the station on the bad nights and sit in the office because Emil had quietly moved his desk lamp so that the office window was the only spot on the lot from which you could see the road, and so she'd always know if his truck came by. He gave her coffee and let her be, and he never once told her she ought to leave, because he'd worked out long ago that telling people what to do only sends them back into the dark faster. A man just out of the provincial jail in Monteith, whom nobody in Wardlow Bend would hire, whom Emil fed every morning for 2 months, and then, without a word about it, walked across the highway to Toivo, who put him on at the feed store, where the man still worked 20 years later. A family burned out of a trailer in March who ate every meal in that office for 3 weeks, while Emil told them their money was no good to him, and then took precisely nothing when they tried to settle up. Every entry the same shape, date, person, what they needed, what he did, no verdict, no sermon, no column for what was owed. He wasn't keeping books to collect. He was keeping books so that someday, somebody would know these people had been real. She untied the letters and the twine came apart in her fingers. Lined paper folded small, the letters drawn one at a time. Dear Mr. Kilgour, you gassed up my car the winter my husband was laid off from the mill, and you never once made me feel like I was taking. You said the coupon book was expiring anyway. There was no coupon book. My oldest is a paramedic now. I tell them about the man with the light on. Thank you. Typed, plain paper, no signature. Mr. Kilgour, you won't remember me. I came through 11 years ago in a bad way, on my way to do something I can't put down on paper here, and I pulled in because your light was on and I figured I might as well not do it hungry. You put a bowl of soup in front of me and you talked to me about the Leafs for 2 hours, and you never asked me one question. Somewhere in there I decided to keep on. I wanted you to know I'm still here. 3 lines on the back of a Canadian Tire receipt. You let me sit in that office every Tuesday for a year and a half after my wife passed. Nobody else did. I haven't got the words, and one in a child's careful printing, with a crayon drawing underneath of a little building and a yellow ball of light on a stick. Mr. Emil, thank you for the tow. Mom cried, but the good kind. Roberta read 9 of them and then she stopped, because she couldn't read anymore. She was still sitting there when a man came across the highway. She saw him through the office window. 69 or 70, thick through the shoulders, in a canvas coat, walking with the deliberate care of a man whose knees have begun to file complaints. He came from the low building opposite with the hand-painted sign reading Routio Feed and Tackle, and there'd been a light on in there since before she arrived. He let himself in. The bell gave its one dull note. He looked at her, and then past her, at the lifted panel in the parts room floor, and the ledgers spread across the concrete, and he let a long breath out through his nose. You're Bertie, he said. It wasn't a question. You've got his stubborn right around the eyes. How did you know him? The man pulled one of the vinyl chairs around and lowered himself into it. Toivo Rauchio, feed store's mine. Your dad and me go back 38 years. He nodded at the open floor. So you found it. I always did wonder which one of you would. You knew about this? I knew some. Nobody knew all of it. Only Emil knew all of it. He rubbed his palms on his knees. Your father kept my boy alive one winter and never said a word about it to me or anybody. That's the first thing you ought to have. 1994. My son was 19 and drinking, and I'd thrown him out of my house because I was a stupid man with a temper, and Emil put him on that cot for 2 months and fed him and got him to work at 6 every morning and never once let on. I found out at the funeral, from somebody else. 31 years I looked at that man across a highway every day and he never told me. Toivo told her the rest of it slowly, the way you'd hand somebody a heavy thing. How the regulars all knew Emil was soft and none of them knew the size of it. How he'd shut the bay at 6 like anybody and then leave the yard light burning on the pole, and that was the signal. The truckers knew it. The drifters knew it. Half the county knew it without ever once saying it out loud. As long as that light was on, you could knock at any hour and Emil would open up, and there'd be heat and food and no questions. How he kept the tin on the shelf by the register, where the men who understood what it was for would drop their change, so that the next one could get where they were going. And how for the last 12 years, since Emil's hands went bad, it was Toivo who'd been splitting that birch and packing that stove, and these last 14 months, climbing a stepladder in the dark to change the bulb on that pole, because he could not stand to be the man who let Emil Kilgour's light go out. He told me once, Toivo said, and stopped and started again. He said the cooking and the towing was the easy part. It was after. He'd send somebody up the road at 3 in the morning, and then he'd lie on that cot the rest of the night wondering if they got where they were going. Because there wasn't anywhere else. Not out here. He was it. The whole safety net was one tired man and a light bulb. Roberta's phone went off in her coat pocket. "Warren." "Hey," her brother said, in the flat, reasonable voice he used right before he was about to be reasonable at her. "I got a piece of Dad's forwarded mail. Tax assessment on a commercial property, Highway 11. It's deeded to him. Do you know anything about that? It's the station. That's my point. That was supposed to be in the estate valuation. If he was sitting on real property that nobody disclosed, that changes the split." A pause. "And there's something else. Ministry's rebuilding that junction for the mine haul road. There's a numbered company been calling me since Tuesday. They want that corner. All of it. They opened at $340,000, Bertie." She said nothing. Across the office, Toivo went very still. "You hear me? 340. For a building we were about to give to a scrapper. It's not for sale," Roberta said. "Of course it's for sale. It's a boarded-up gas station with a bad septic. What else in the world would it be? It's a trust." Her voice came out level, and she heard it come out level and was surprised. "Held for what he held it for. You can phone his lawyers, Halloran and Vance." The line went quiet a good while. When Warren spoke again, the reasonable had drained out of it. "What kind of trust?" "Dad changed oil for 43 years. Dad did not set up trusts." She heard him breathe. "Bertie, listen to me. At the end there he was not tracking. Secret accounts. Buying land and telling nobody. Cutting a hole in his own floor. That's not a rational man. We need a lawyer to look at all of this before you put your name on one single thing. You had the house listed in 11 days, Roberta said. You had a realtor measuring rooms with the flowers still on the table. You took the savings. You took the truck. You sold his tools to a stranger off the internet. You handed me a building you called a liability and 2 boxes you called nothing. And now there's $340,000 on the table. And all of a sudden you care what happens out here." It was a voice she hadn't used in 15 months. The shop voice. The one for when a weld's going bad and somebody has to stop panicking and start thinking. "What is it you want, Warren?" He didn't answer right away. "We're not finished with this." "No," she said, "we're not." She hung up, and her hand was steady, and Toivo Rauchio was watching her with something on his face that took her a full second to recognize as relief. "He picked right," Toivo said quietly. "Emil, he picked right. If you're still riding with Bertie, do us one favor and hit subscribe before you go any further. Because what the people of Wardlow Bend did when her brother walked into a courtroom is the part of this story we've been waiting the whole time to tell you." She didn't drive back to Sudbury that night. She slept on her father's cot with 3 gray blankets and the stove ticking down beside her, and she lay awake a long time listening to the transports come through the cut and watching the yard light lay a pale rectangle across the ceiling. She thought about a 22-year-old girl walking north on the shoulder with her hands in her pockets, and a tired young man watching her go. Toivo brought coffee in the morning, and a woman Roberta didn't know. Verna Chiasson was 76, silver, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the bearing of somebody who had been in charge of something for a very long time. She'd pumped gas and kept the books at Kilgour Motors for 29 years, and now ran the kitchen at the Legion in town. She stopped inside the door, put a hand over her mouth, and stood there a moment before she could come any further in. "I've been wondering which one of you was going to turn up," she said. "I hoped it'd be you." She crossed the office and took Roberta's face in both hands and looked at her hard. "I knew you when you were 7 years old, standing on an oil pail organizing his sockets. You've got your mother's mouth. He talked about you more than you'd ever credit." "You knew," Roberta said. "The light, the tin, all of it. Honey, I knew all of it." Verna sat down across from her like she'd done it 10,000 times because she had. "I'd flip the sign at 6 and your dad would say, 'Leave the pole on, Verna.' And I knew. Plenty of nights I stayed and cooked on that hot plate beside him for whoever knocked. We had a woman go into labor on that counter in '88, while we waited 50 minutes on an ambulance out of Englehart. We had men in here I was scared of, and men I wanted to take home and feed forever. We never turned one single person away. Not one in 29 years. How many?" Verna looked out the window at the highway. "I couldn't begin to tell you. Some nights nobody came. Some nights it was 3. Take that times 43 winters." She shook her head. "He hated the word charity. Wouldn't have it etched in the building. He said he was only running a garage that happened to never quite close. He said charity makes a person feel small for needing it, And the whole point was that nobody who came through that door ever had to feel small. You don't need a reason to come in out of the cold. Cold's reason enough. That's what he'd say. Word for word, 40 years. While they talked, people came. Not for gas. There was no gas. They came for Bertie, because word had gone through Wardlow Bend overnight the way it does, that Emil Kilgour's daughter was out at the station asking questions. A woman in her 40s came first, holding the elbow of a grown son. 22 years ago, her water broke on the 11 in a January storm with the hospital 50 minutes out and her car in the ditch. She'd seen the light on the pole and walked the last half-kilometer holding her belly. Emil and Verna had laid her on the office counter on a folded pile of shop rags and kept the two of them warm and alive until the ambulance came. He was the first 15 minutes, the woman said, and her eyes went. Your father was my son's first 15 minutes. After her came an old man who said Emil had let him sit in this office every Tuesday for a year and a half after his wife died. No charge, no reason, just so he'd have somewhere to put his pants on for. After him came a man about Roberta's age who said, very quietly, that he'd come through 11 years back intending to drive his truck off the rock cut at kilometer 212. And the only reason he hadn't was that he'd stopped at a lit-up garage first, because he didn't feel like doing it hungry, and the old man behind the counter had talked to him about hockey for 2 hours and never once asked what was wrong. He had a wife now, he said, a daughter in grade 5. He never knew what he did, the man said. I wrote him a letter once, couldn't sign it, too ashamed of where I'd been. Roberta thought of the typed page in the bundle with no name at the bottom, and she didn't say anything, but she put her hand on his arm. And in the late afternoon, a boy of 19 turned up on a bicycle in November with a toque and no gloves, and stood in the doorway the way people stand when they're not certain they're allowed inside. Kieran, he said, I heard you need hands. She did, and he had them. He was quiet and quick, and he worked without being told twice. If you've stayed with Bertie this long, subscribe, because the man who tried to take every bit of this away from her is about to walk into a courtroom in New Liskeard. And what happened in that room is the part of this story we've been waiting to tell you. They got to work. Toivo brought 2 men and a ladder, and they had the soft corner of the roof stripped and redecked in a day and a half. New wire to the bay. A breaker panel with the circuits actually labeled. Verna scrubbed the office down to the wood and put up a curtain. Nobody asked for. Kieran took the front of the place, and he took it the way a person takes something he means to be good at. He sanded and painted the pole. He cleaned the office window so you could see the far ditch through it. He sat an hour with Verna learning how Emil made the coffee, the exact scoop, the pinch of salt in the grounds, the whole ridiculous ceremony of it, and he learned it the way. You learn a thing from somebody who learned it from somebody else, a chain of small knowledge running back through 40 years of 6 a.m. Roberta took the bay, which was the only room in her life she had ever entirely understood. She broke the hoist down to its pins. She rebuilt the compressor. She scraped 4 decades of hardened grease out of the pit with a putty knife until her shoulder screamed. And on the 3rd day, needing a bracket for the stovepipe, she lit her father's old buzz box for the first time in 15 months and laid a bead across cold steel, and her hands were not strangers to her at all. She found, scratched into the underside of the workbench where no customer would ever look, the letters EK and a date from before she was born, and beside them, in a child's crooked gouge, a lopsided B she had no memory of making and knew instantly was hers. She knelt there with her thumb in the groove of it for a long while. Then she went back to work. At night she read the ledgers, and near the back of the 3rd one, in ink darker than the rest, in an entry dated 15 months ago, she found herself. Bertie called tonight. She sounded like the floor had gone out from under her. The shop's finished. She didn't come out and say it. She never says anything straight, that girl, but I could hear it in the way she talked around the edges of it. She's blaming herself. I know that sound. I've made it. I made it the whole winter after I sent that girl up the road. She thinks she failed at the one thing she ever loved, and that it says something about who she is. It doesn't. Losing a thing you poured yourself into isn't a verdict on you. It's a Tuesday that went bad and then kept on going. She won't let me say any of that to her. Too proud, like her mother. Proud as a fence post in February. But she'll come out here someday when I'm gone, and she'll find what I've been at, and maybe then she'll see why a man keeps a light on even when he's the only one who can see it. Maybe she'll keep it on herself. I never could tell her I was proud of her without it coming out sideways. So I'm telling the book. I'm proud of her. I always was, and I'm sorry I was no good at saying it while I still had the voice for it. Roberta set the ledger down on the counter and pressed both palms flat against it, the way her father used to. She had never told him about the shop. She'd told the bank and the trustee and 6 people she sent home. She had never once phoned her father and said the words "I failed," because she couldn't bear the thought of him, knowing his daughter had lost the very thing she'd traded him away for. But he'd known. He'd heard it in 2 minutes on a telephone, the way a father hears the thing his kid is standing in front of. And he hadn't pushed, and he hadn't lectured, and he hadn't handed her advice she wasn't ready to hold. He wrote it in a book she was only ever meant to find if she came looking. And she cried then, and it wasn't the quiet kind. It came up out of somewhere she'd had welded shut for years. The application came from Warren's lawyer that Friday. It sought to set aside the trust on grounds of incapacity and undue influence, citing Emil Kilgour's concealed accounts, his undisclosed real property, and his secretion of assets beneath the floor of his own premises as evidence of a mind no longer sound. Toivo came down off the roof when he saw her face through the clean window. "He's saying Dad was crazy," she said. Toivo went to his truck and came back with a Rubbermaid bin. Inside were 12 years of invoices, every drum of stove oil, every cord of birch, every part he'd ordered in, every one of them with a note from Emil in the corner in that clean block hand, telling him exactly what he wanted next and why, and what it should cost. Everyone signed, everyone dated. He wrote every line of these himself, Toivo said. Sharp as a tack right to the last one, and Verna's got the Legion books. And there's 200 people in this township who sat across that counter from him last spring and watched him remember their kids' names. He set the bin on the counter. They want to call that man crazy. They're going to have to do it in a full room. The hearing was on a Tuesday afternoon at the courthouse in New Liskeard. The day before, Roberta's phone rang with a number she didn't know, and a woman introduced herself as Chinaza Nankemalu, of Halloran and Vance, her father's solicitors, and said she'd like Roberta to understand exactly what her father had built before she walked into that room. Your father came to us 9 years ago and settled an irrevocable trust. You are the sole trustee. The land and the funds are dedicated to one purpose, in his words, the provision of shelter, heat, and safe passage to any person in need, in perpetuity. He chose that word. He wanted it to outlive every one of us. It cannot be sold, wound up, or redirected, and it was drafted from the beginning to withstand precisely the challenge your brother is bringing. A pause. He told me a son who measured things in dollars would come along eventually. He wanted the door bolted before that day arrived. Roberta closed her eyes. He came back every year for 9 years to review the terms. His last visit was 7 weeks before he died. He was lucid, specific, and difficult, which I found reassuring. He also left a note in the file to be read to you, if it came to this. It says, she'll be ashamed when she finds it. Tell her guilt is just love with nowhere left to put itself. Tell her to give it a stove. The courtroom was small. 2 tables at the front, 6 rows of chairs behind. Roberta sat at the left table beside Nkemelu, who had driven 3.5 hours. Warren sat at the right beside his own lawyer. Deirdre was behind him with her coat still done up, and the back rows when Roberta turned to look were full. The woman whose son was born on the office counter, and the son beside her, 22 and enormous and mortified. The old man from the Tuesday chair, the man from the rock cut, Verna upright, hands folded, Toivo in a clean shirt, Kieran beside him, 4 people from the Legion, 2 from the reserve up the road, a man Roberta had never met who turned out to be the one who'd been fed for 2 months and hired across the highway in 2004. And in the second row, an old woman in a wool coat, very small with a cane between her knees. Warren's lawyer made his argument. Secrecy, undisclosed assets, cash purchases. A hole cut in a concrete floor, a pattern, he said, of conduct inconsistent with a sound and rational mind. Nkemelu answered with the medical records first. Annual physicals, the last 9 weeks of his life. Alert, oriented, competent. Then the invoices in Emil's hand. Then the Legion's books, the deliveries logged, the receipts, and then she did a thing the law did not require and the judge allowed. She let the room speak. The mother stood and told about the storm and the counter and her son's first 15 minutes. The man from the rock cut stood, and his voice came apart in the middle of it, and he said, "This man kept me alive and never knew he'd done it. And a sane man does that. A sane man does that for 43 years on purpose." The old man stood and said, "For a year and a half after my wife died, that garage was the only reason I put my boots on, and there was not one thing wrong with Emil Kilgour's mind. The wrong was all in mine. He fixed it a coffee at a time. And then the small woman in the second row stood up with her cane, and the room went entirely quiet, because nobody had known she was coming. "My name is Odette Poirier," she said. "I'm 79 years old. My sister Cassie died in a ditch on Highway 11 in 1982, 3 kilometers north of that garage." Roberta's whole body went cold. "Emil Kilgour bought my groceries for 30 years, the old woman said. "He never told me why. He fixed my car and lost the bill. When my husband passed, he plowed my lane every storm for 11 winters and wouldn't take $1. I thought he was just a kind man. I found out 4 days ago, from his daughter's own boy over there, what he was carrying." She looked over at Warren, and she did not look away. "You want to say he was out of his mind? I'll tell you what he was. He was a man who did one wrong thing when he was young and tired, and then he spent the rest of his life making sure it never happened to anybody else on his road. If that's crazy, then I've never in my life met a sane person, and I don't care to." She sat down. Nobody spoke for a while, and Warren sat through every bit of it, and he didn't look at his lawyer, and he didn't look at his wife, and he watched the faces of one person after stand up and describe a father he had lived in the same house with for 18 years, and somehow never once met. The judge reserved for 40 minutes and came back and dismissed the application. The trust stood. Roberta was sole trustee, and because the court found the application had been brought for a collateral purpose, namely the sale of trust property, to a third party, His Honor ordered costs against Warren Kilgour personally in the amount of $39,000. Deirdre was at the door before Phil had properly finished. She did not wait for him. She was gone from the marriage before Christmas, and that is the last we will say about her, because she is not what this story is about. Warren stayed in his chair a moment. Then he stood and walked toward the back, and he had to pass every single row of people who had come there for his father. He didn't stop. But as he came even with the end of Roberta's row, his steps slowed, and his eyes found hers, and under the anger was something she had never seen on her brother's face before. A crack. The first hairline in a certainty he'd been carrying since the morning after the funeral. Then he pushed through the door. Spring came late, the way it does up there. Kilgour Motors was a different building by then. New roof. New wire, the window clean. Toivo's crew put in a proper septic, and the township signed it off. Kieran built a bench along the office wall out of barnboard and stained it himself. Verna came back, not to pump gas, because there was no gas, but to run the front 2 days a week, because she said a woman can only make so many Legion casseroles before she starts to miss the highway. Toivo made a new sign for the pole from a sheet of reclaimed tin, and Kieran painted it, and it read Kilgour's, and underneath, smaller, "Open. Nobody freezes on my road." Roberta studied the trust documents at the counter at night, in Camelu's careful pages stacked beside her father's ledgers, and she learned how he'd built the thing to do exactly one job forever. Keep the stove hot, keep the light on. Get the next one where they were going. Out of $46,000 saved 2 at a time. She put the tobacco tin back on the shelf by the register, with for the tin on a fresh strip of masking tape, and people started dropping their change in it again as though it had never once stopped. The morning she opened, Warren's car pulled onto the gravel. He stood in the doorway with his hands at his sides. No Deirdre. He looked at the bench and the counter and the photograph of a laughing young man in a peaked cap, and at the board over the bay door. "Can we talk?" he said. She walked out past him and he followed, and they stopped by the pole with the morning sun warm on it. "I sat in that room," Warren said. He was looking at the building, not at her. "I listened to every one of them. And about halfway through, I worked out something I ought to have known when I was 10. His voice stayed level, and the levelness was costing him everything he had. I didn't know him. I thought I did. I knew a man who got up at 5 and came home, smelling like a shop rag, and fell asleep in his chair, and I spent my entire life a little bit embarrassed by him, by the coveralls, by how small it all was. I never asked what tired him out. It never crossed my mind that there was anything to ask." Roberta leaned against the pole and waited. She'd learned that from the ledgers. You let people arrive by themselves. He kept it from me because he knew precisely what I'd have said. Warren almost laughed, and it didn't clear his throat. I'd have called it a waste. A man giving away gas and food at 2 in the morning to people who'll never pay him back. I'd have told him to smarten up. He shook his head slowly. He was right not to tell me. He took an envelope out of his jacket. "House sold for $281. My half, after the mortgage and the costs and what the judge took off me, comes to about $9,000. He held it out. "It's made out to the trust. It isn't enough. I know that. For 43 years of it, it isn't anywhere near. Roberta took it. She looked at the check and then at her brother, and he was not the man who had dropped a ring of keys on a kitchen counter and called this place a liability. He was not an entirely different man either. He was a man standing in a gravel lot trying to do a thing he had absolutely no practice at. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. He didn't try to hug her and she didn't reach for him, and maybe that would come and maybe it wouldn't, but he was standing there, and for now that was the whole of it. She went inside and she didn't put the check in the bank. She folded it once and dropped it in the tobacco tin on the shelf by the register, where the change went. Kieran watched her do it. He didn't say anything. "Your last name's Poirier," Roberta said. "Yeah, Odette's your great-grandmother." "Yeah." He wiped the counter that didn't need wiping. "Cassie was my grandmother's sister. Nobody in my family ever talked about her much. Just that she went walking one night." He set the rag down. "Grandma Odette told me the whole thing after your dad's funeral. That's why I came out on the bike." He looked up. "I wanted to see the light he left on for her." The bell over the door gave its one dull note. It was nearly 9 at night, and the ditches were still holding snow in the shade. A woman came in, maybe 30, in a coat too thin for that time of year, with a boy of about 4 asleep against her shoulder. Her car was out on the shoulder with the hood up and the four-ways going. "There's a light on," she said. "The girl at the Esso in town said if there's a light on out here you can just come in." "That's right," Roberta said. "Come in, sit anywhere. That bench by the stove's the warm one." She sat them down and she went and put a pot on the hot plate, and she felt her father's kitchen around her, and it was hers now, and her hands knew exactly where everything was. "I've got some money," the woman started. "I can pay for the tow, I just need to." "You don't need a reason to come in out of the cold," Roberta said. "Cold's reason enough." She fed them, and Kieran went out with a flashlight and found the alternator belt shredded, and Toivo had one across the road because Toivo has everything across the road. And when the boy woke up, he ate 2 grilled cheese sandwiches cut on the diagonal, the way her father used to cut hers when she was small enough to stand on an oil pail. At 11 the woman tried to leave, and Roberta said the road north was ice from Latchford up, and the cot was made and nobody was putting anybody back out there tonight. And the woman put her face in her hands at that, and her shoulders came down from around her ears, and she didn't say anything at all for a while. Late, with the boy asleep and the stove ticking and Kieran gone home on his bike with a lamp strapped to the handlebars, Roberta went into the parts room and lifted the panel and looked into the footlocker. It was empty now. The ledgers were on the shelf where anybody could read them. The letters were framed on the office wall. The deed was with the trust, the passbook at the credit union, the tin full and out where it belonged. Everything her father had sealed under his own floor in the dark was up in the light, turned into a roof and a septic and a sign that said what he'd been saying for 43 years to a road that never once thanked him. She closed the panel. She went out the office door into the cold. The pole stood black against a sky with too many stars in it, the way northern skies get when the temperature's dropping. She looked up at the bulb burning on it. The one Toivo had refused to let go dark for 14 months. The one her father had kept lit every night since a 22-year-old girl walked north with her hands in her pockets, on her way to a sister who did not know she was coming. Emil Kilgour spent his whole life warming the people nobody else warmed, asking nothing, telling no one, keeping one bulb burning against a very large dark. And when his hands finally quit, he hid the truth of it under his own floor and trusted that the daughter who'd lost her way would come out here to throw it all away and find it instead and find herself in it, somewhere south of there, tonight or tomorrow night or the night after. Somebody is going to come around the long bend at kilometer 209, with nothing left in the tank and nowhere to be. And they're going to see a yard light burning over a low gray building on the west side of the highway. And they'll know, the way this whole township has known for 2 generations, that as long as that light is on, somebody in there is awake, and the door will open, and the stove is hot, and nobody is going to ask them a single question they don't feel like answering. Roberta Kilgour stood under the pole in the cold with her breath going up white, and she did not turn it off. There was work in the morning, and the morning after, and every morning after that for as long as she had hands. She was ready. So tell us, before you go, somewhere in your life there's a light somebody left on for you, and you might not have known it at the time. Or maybe there's one you're keeping burning right now for a person who has no idea. Whose light are you keeping on? We read every one of these. Tell us down below.